Who was the most popular Western sci-fi writer in the USSR? Yeah, if you don't know, the sci-fi was a really big deal in the Soviet times, and some of the Western sci-fi writers were very popular in the Soviet Union. But there was a small caveat to that. Well, maybe not actually small, but a really huge caveat. If you want to know what I'm talking about, stay tuned to this video. Hi, I'm Nick Hein, and on this channel I'm overloading my brain trying to talk with crappy accent and very bad grammar about the books and every other things related to writing and reading. I was born in the USSR and my sci-fi journey started back then, so I know a thing or two about how publishing sci-fi coexisted with the communist ideology. Surprisingly, it wasn't a total wasteland. A lot of Western sci-fi writers were published in the USSR. But today I'm going to tell you about those who were most popular and beloved in the Soviet Union, somehow managing to slip through the Iron Curtain. As I already said, the science fiction in the USSR was very popular, but at the same time it existed, so to speak, on the outskirts of the mainstream culture. The biggest problem, the caveat I was talking about, was the ideology. Everything published in the USSR, from the newspaper article to the thickest book, went through the special organization for clearance. There were many changes in the very long and bureaucratic name of this organization, but it was commonly referenced as Glavlit. The Communist Party needed total control of what people were reading and thus thinking. This system worked, but of course it was impossible to control everything. Science fiction was one of the loopholes in this cumbersome mechanism, because A. it was considered not really serious literature, and B. it was sometimes really hard for wooden-brained bureaucrats to figure out what was really going on in the sci-fi stories. Actually, the proper sci-fi depicting the bright communist future of the mankind was of course even approved by the Communist Party. I guess no big surprise here. In fact, one of the founders of the Bolshevik Party, Alexander Bogdanov, even wrote a science fiction novel in the 1908, almost 10 years before his comrades seized the power. The novel was called The Red Star. Not this star, but this one. It was a name for Mars, where he placed an advanced alien civilization visited by the man from Earth. Lenin, though, didn't approve of that novel and Bogdanov's ideas in general, surprisingly without much repercussions for Bogdanov. They just sort of drifted apart. Anyway, my point is that the Western science fiction was published in the USSR and was very popular. The demand for the science fiction was actually so high that it was quite a task to buy it. Almost every edition of reasonably decent sci-fi book would sell out as soon as it hit the bookstore shelves. But I think it's time for us to jump right into the details. Let's talk about the most popular Western sci-fi authors in the USSR, shall we? Isaac Asimov. He was one of the most well-known and popular Western world sci-fi writers in the USSR, not least for his novel The End of Eternity, which was even adapted decently for the time for the television. Other novels by Asimov, very popular in the USSR, were The Caves of Steel and The Gods Themselves, plus assorted short stories and some of his popular science work. And yet, at the same time, a lot of his work was never heard of in the Soviet Union, like the Lucky Star young adult books or everything depicting the Galactic Empire, including the Foundation series. You were not supposed to read and talk about the imperial future of the galaxy in the Marxist state. Next comes another writer from the sci-fi big three, author Clarke. He was also very popular in the USSR, and with the same caveats as Asimov. About half of his novels were translated and successfully published, including Space Odyssey 2001, Rendezvous with Rama, The Sands of Mars, and a few others with assorted short stories and novelettes as topping, like my favorite, for example, A Meeting with Medusa. But some of his biggest books, like Childhood End, were absolute no-go for obvious reasons. No communist future in this one. The long-lasting affair of Clarke with Soviet censorship ended overnight in 1984, when one of the popular Soviet magazines started to publish Odyssey 2, which was dedicated to Andrei Sakharov, Soviet scientist and dissident, and all of the Russian characters in the novel were bearing the names of famous Russian dissidents. After that, not a single story by Clarke was published in the USSR until late 1980s, when the censorship organization crumbled. But before we go to the next writer, I want to add something. There is an interesting story concerning the history of the Clarke's publications in the USSR, which shows how weird and complicated and malfunctioning the Soviet censorship system was. I was under total impression that one of the greatest Clarke's novels, The City and the Stars, was just as off limits for the Soviet publishers as the Childhood's End was. But about a week ago, I accidentally stumbled upon the fact that it was actually published in the Soviet Times, only not in Russian. It was published in 1981 in Estonia, where I was born and still living, which was by that time the part of the USSR as one of the 15 Soviet republics. You can see this book right here, Lin ja tähed, which means in Estonian, The City and the Stars. And it wasn't even that hard to find a buy copy. I guess we were so far away from the Moscow speaking some obscure language that they even didn't notice, or maybe they don't really give a shit what was going on the outskirts of the USSR. But let's move on. The next writer I want to mention is Ray Bradbury. Naturally, his most famous book in the USSR was Fahrenheit 451, because it was pretty much in vibe with the official ideology about the degradation of capitalist society. There were several editions of this novel in the USSR, and although it's hard to find any information on some of them, I roughly calculated that it will be safe to say that there were easily a few million copies of the novel sold until the mid-80s, when the communist censorship died and the publishing floodgates were open. That's not counting his other works, like Martian Chronicles, Dandelion Vine, and various short stories, which were also very popular. Of course, those of the Bradbury's works that were going deep into the mystical side of the creativity were absolutely off limits for the Soviet readers and were translated only after the USSR ceased to exist. I'd say those were the big three of the Western sci-fi writers most popular in the USSR, though of course quite a few others were published too. Mostly it was only one selected novel or several short stories, and sometimes, due to the weird amorphous nature of the Soviet censorship, it were the books you wouldn't expect to be published, like Death World by Harry Harrison or The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester. It was also very strange that in the Soviet public libraries those strict rules were barely implemented, especially when we are talking about the books in foreign languages. I remember my mother reading really cool books in English by authors absolutely forbidden in the USSR, like Heinlein, Frank Herbert or James Ballard. Actually, that was the initial trigger for me to start learning English, but I think that's the case for another separate video. Anyway, to finish this video, I want to mention one sci-fi writer who was literally approved by the Lenin himself. In 1920, Herbert George Wells visited Soviet Russia and had a pleasant conversation with Lenin. And even though he later drifted away from the socialist ideas, this very fact was enough to make him hands off the most published Western science fiction writer throughout the whole history of the USSR. Millions and millions of copies of his books were sold. For example, his novel The Time Machine was published more than 40 times. Hopefully, this fact removes at least some of the clickbait vibes from my thumbnails, and hopefully you like my story. Thank you for watching this video and see you next time. Bye.